Hello, grade 12 students. Here we go to the sexual cycle revision. Menstrual cycle of the female may be divided into the ovarian cycle, or the sexual cycle is divided into ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle. So the ovarian and the uterine cycle, these two cycles, they are synchronized. They work with each other. They are periodic. So you have to know that the cycle before the ovulation, after ovulation, post-ovulatory and pre-ovulatory. So pre before the ovulation and the post after the ovulation. So you have to know that follicular phase of the ovarian cycle, and we have here the luteal phase. These two cycles just before the ovulation is called a follicular phase, where we have development of the follicle from the promoter to the primary to the secondary, tertiary, and to the Graafian follicle with the fully mature one, and just before ovulation, which leads to the rupture and the release of the oocyte 2 at day 14 of the ovulation, and the luteal phase, which includes the rupture of the Graafian follicle and the formation of the corpus luteum, the yellow body, which is responsible for the secretion of the hormones estrogen and progesterone, and it persists for 3 months if there is pregnancy, while if there is no pregnancy, this will degenerate into corpus albicans, which is the white body, which is remnant and non-functional. However, the uterine cycle is divided into the periodic cycle and the period, and we have the proliferative phase, where we have thickening of the endometrium, and the secretory phase just after the ovulation, which includes the formation of the uterine lace and the highest thickening of the innermost layer of the uterus, which is called the endometrium. So as the uterus is known to be the site of implantation of the zygote, which was produced in the ovary, then the ovary and the uterus, they synchronize their cycles. Here, as we said, we have the endometrium, the innermost layer, and we have about 8 to 10 days before the ovulation. The uterus knows that the oocyte 2 start to resume meiosis 2 and will be soon enough to be ready to be released. The uterus will anticipate the fertilization and formation of the zygote. As such, it will prepare itself for the major event. The tube-like glands will start to appear in the endometrium lining. The role of these tube-like glands is to sustain and to nourish the embryo. As well, spiral blood vessels start to form. Spiral blood vessels hold more blood, so more nutrition for the embryo. As I said before, the endometrium is the innermost layer of the uterus, and you have to know this is the endometrium, the innermost lining of the uterus. And you have to know the part of the uterine cycle, it's known as the secretory phase. It's under the effect of the hormones estrogen and progesterone produced by the corpus luteum during the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle. Here, this figure is showing the development of the follicles during the ovarian cycle, the follicular phase, where development of the follicle to reach the fully mature one just before the ovulation, the Graafian follicle, which releases the oocyte 2, and this release of the oocyte 2 leads to the rupture of the follicle and the formation of the corpus luteum, the yellow body, which is responsible for the secretion of the hormones estrogen and progesterone. So as you see here in the ovarian hormones, we have a peak of estradiol, the one in green, estradiol, just before the ovulation, no progesterone. However, after ovulation, both hormones are released, estrogen and progesterone, at the luteal phase. Both hormones, they are secreted by the corpus luteum. So here we have the Graafian follicle, and the Graafian follicle, as I said, it ruptures at ovulation and leads to the formation of the corpus luteum, the yellow body. However, the gonadotropic hormone that are the LH and the FSH, they are observed at the day before the ovulation, day 12, 13 before the ovulation. So these hormones, LH and FSH, they are secreted by the anterior pituitary gland. You have to know that in the uterine cycle, what do we have? We have menstruation, which includes the rupture, or let's say the sloughing of the innermost layer or the superficial layer of the endometrium. So rupture or the sloughing lead to the menstruation and the bleeding. Proliferative phase, the thickening of the endometrium, it increases, while during the secretory phase, we have what's known by the uterine lace. If fertilization occurs, the fetus will be implanted in the uterus. So sometimes you ask about what is the role of the uterus for the site of the implantation of the embryo, while where eventually the endometrium will form what's known by the placenta. However, if there is no fertilization, so between day 0 and day 6 of the menstrual cycle, the superficial layer of the endometrium, which is rich in connective tissue, will be sloughed off. Sloughing of the superficial layer of the endometrium, the spiral blood vessels will be exposed to high pressure. That's why they will lead to the bleeding. This is known as menstruation or the menses stage, which is due to the drop in the levels of estrogen and progesterone after the drop or degeneration of the corpus luteum into the corpus albicans. Here also the graph showing the different hormones, the ovarian hormones, the gonadotropic hormones LH and FSH, as well as the thickening and the endometrium in the uterine cycle. So hypothalamus pituitary axis. From its name, hypothalamus pituitary axis, it's situated at the base of the brain, just above the pituitary gland. This hypothalamus includes neurons that secrete hormones. That's why the hormone, which is called gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH, is called a neurohormone, since it's secreted by the hormones that's secreted by neurons in the hypothalamus. This hormone, the gonadotropin releasing hormone, will travel to the pituitary gland through the bloodstream. So GnRH is secreted by the hypothalamus in a discontinuous manner or in a pulsatile manner. This will move to the pituitary gland to stimulate it to secrete what's known by the gonadotropic hormones, LH and FSH. So what is the pituitary gland? Pituitary gland is a small gland connected to the hypothalamus through the hypophyseal vascular duct. It consists of two parts, posterior pituitary and anterior pituitary. So anterior pituitary gland, this is the figure that's located at the hypothalamus pituitary axis region. So pituitary gland secrete the gonadotropin stimulating hormones like the follicular stimulating hormone that's called the FSH and the luteinizing hormone, the LH, which is called the gonadotropic hormones. The anterior pituitary hormones that it's called FSH and LH, they stimulate the growth and the maturation of the cavitary follicle into the fully mature Graafian. The LH promotes the transformation of the degenerated follicle whenever it's ruptured and releases the oocyte 2 with day 14 of the cycle, which is the ovulation, into the corpus luteum, or it's called the yellow body. So this figure, you have to copy it in your brain. This we have the estradiol just before the ovulation secreted by the follicles at the internal theca and the granulosa of the follicular cells, and after ovulation we have both estradiol and progesterone that are secreted by the corpus luteum. So corpus luteum or the yellow body. However, LH and FSH we have only peak just before ovulation, so there is no peaks after the ovulation for LH and FSH. We're going to talk about this in the coming slides. So during the follicular phase, what happens? FSH, it stimulates the development of the follicles, which mature and they secrete moderate amount of estrogen, which stimulate the proliferation of the superficial layer of the endometrium and leads to thickening. This will exert a negative feedback. So whenever we have a moderate amount of estrogen, we have negative feedback on the hypothalamus pituitary axis, and this will result in the decrease in the level of LH and FSH. However, if we have during the follicular phase high level of estrogen, it reaches a peak at day 12. This high level will exert a positive feedback. So high level of estradiol exerts a positive feedback on the anterior pituitary hypothalamus pituitary axis and exactly on the pituitary gland to secrete high level of LH and FSH. Just before the ovulation, about day 13, peak of LH will trigger the ovulation. During the luteal phase, what happens? The ruptured follicle, which will transform into the corpus luteum or the yellow body under the effect of LH. Corpus luteum, it secretes estrogen and progesterone. This will lead to the formation of the uterine lace and the thickening of the endometrium will reach the maximum. This exerts a negative feedback. So high levels at the luteal phase exerts a negative feedback, so low levels of LH and FSH. So you have to keep it in mind. We have only positive feedback just before the ovulation, and the follicular phase when we have high level of estradiol. However, when we have a moderate level, there is a negative feedback, and after ovulation, high level of estrogen, progesterone, both, it will have a negative feedback. So whenever we have to talk about the negative and positive feedback, we have to talk about the estradiol.